Welcome to China Manufacturing Decoded from Sofeast, the podcast where we take you through some of the major topics facing importers and manufacturers in China today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Manufacturing Decoded. And today we are joined again by Clive and Max. Clive has been on the podcast a few times, just quickly, highly experienced quality and operations executive and consultant, these days working mostly on medical devices, new product introduction. And Max from the MTG/CMC group, who is a highly experienced consultant who worked for a long time in the auto industry and consulted for several large companies in that industry, and comes with a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of good advice. And these days he is in the UAE consulting for companies and organizations there. All right, so the topic of today is the cost of quality, and specifically the cost of poor quality. And we'll unpack this, what it means exactly. And then we'll talk about, where it comes from, how to prevent it, what is the most important section of the cost of poor quality to focus on, and so on. So first question is, usually when we talk about cost of quality, or let's say costs related in some way to quality, there's prevention and appraisal, and there's internal failures and external failures. Can one of you guide me a little bit through what this generally includes, what it means?
Yeah, Max, do you want to take that?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, and good day, everybody. So your question there, Renaud, is obviously we're basing this conversation around the cost of quality. If we start from the worst case, which is the external failure, obviously the cost of quality from a failure of a product once it's out in the market could be catastrophic. Certainly, having worked in the automotive industry and the rail industry, we're all aware of situations where vehicles are recalled because of some failure in a product. That might be due to the production side of it, or it could be a sub-assembly that's supplied in from a third party, a first tier supplier or whatever. So obviously from an external point of view, it's not only a major cost to the company on warranties, on setting up call centers, on feedback systems, etc. When you talk about internal quality issues, if the quality of a product is caught within the production process, then obviously the cost then is rework, which we all know is one of the 7 wastes. So reworking a product is labor intensive. It can also cause problems with your production line, so your ongoing operations. And then you've got your sub-assemblies that you're buying off a supplier, that if that's a product failure, then you've got a recall, etc., etc. So I think there's various ways that you can actually put a cost on it, but ultimately there's all of those have got some form of figure on them. I think the important thing though to consider is, for me personally, is the internal costs, because putting in the systems to be able to recognize quality defects is obviously an important factor, because you don't want the product failing out in the marketplace. But then that goes back to, how do you deal with those, and how do you stop those quality defects from coming through the system?
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I would suggest that the idea of putting a cost on quality itself is probably the wrong way of looking at it, because it should be an investment. You invest in your quality because you are investing in your company, you're investing in your own product. So just trying to put it down as a bottom line cost is probably the wrong way of thinking about this.
So what you're saying is, because so Max covered, just to get back on what I was saying before, Max covered the external failures in the marketplace, hitting the customers, failing in the field and so on, and the internal failures that are caught before the product leaves, before the product hits the customer. People also talk about prevention and also all the cost of appraisal. And I think that's what everybody puts in the category of prevention is really to build quality systems, to train people, to set up the right process controls and so on and so forth, right? And all of this has a cost, but as you say, it's prevention. So you could talk about that as an investment. I get that. What about the appraisal? Because you still need people, to audit what's going on the lines, to inspect the product, and things like that.
Well, that comes under the same sort of heading as far as I would be concerned, because let's assume that you are working on a normal production line with normal production flows. If you have a system in there, what's the first thing that you've got to look at is how stable is that production line? Classic measurement is CP/CPK. That will tell you what your predictive failures are, right? Which means that you can either increase or decrease. And it is all about having the knowledge of how to actually work with predictive failures and how to take that knowledge and look at how you can improve the quality throughput as against the actual end product. So my view that end of line inspection to say that your quality is acceptable is actually a cost. Having inspection at preset stages, which your defeamers will give you, is actually saving. It's actually cost saving, is that, because you're not making a bad product and it going through the entire production line until it gets to the end and all of a sudden it fails. That is waste in the purest, simplest form that you can see. So having systems and investing in your systems to get to a point where you are working in as close to a zero defects environment as you can is actually investment, and it's cost saving at the same time. I don't think that you can look at it as pure cost. I think you have to look at it as an investment cost.
Okay,
and all through.
Investment means some people are going to ask, what is the return on investment, right? So then you still need to account for it, for what you invest, and then you want to look at the return, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're touching on there, Renaud. So how do we put a cost on quality defects to be able to do some maths to say, well, okay, if we invest this amount of money, what would our return on investment be based on reduction in quality failures? So I think in its broadest and simplest term, any quality defect is a cost. That's a fact. Whether that part or subassembly becomes scrapped or reworked or whatever that is, there is a cost there. How do you actually put a value onto that? And we've all worked in production and operation environments. It's very difficult to sometimes put costs onto subassemblies going down a production line as an internal cost, because the cost is actually what the customer pays at the end. Yes, we can do some some basic maths to try and understand that, but for me, the investment in the practical problem solving side to solve the problem. So one is highlighting the defect, highlighting the quality defect, but then, as we spoke about in our last podcast, it's what you do about it. That's where the investment comes in, because as Clive's correctly said, the maths is simple. We want zero defects all the way through the process, but that doesn't come through inspection, because inspection is a cost. Now, yes, of course, there are certain manufacturing processes that need external auditing, et cetera, to confirm certain elements of a process. Absolutely. So that's a given that we've got to do that. But any failure is a cost. Therefore, investing in the people and investing in the culture of the defect rectification, but also right down to the root cause to solve those problems.
Yeah, I mean, we all know PDCA. Well, I mean, I put an I in front of that, and that first I there is actually identification. You cannot plan to do anything unless you don't know what you're planning for. So I think that where the real cost savings are, I mean, I believe in quality not as a cost, as actually as a cost saver. And I believe it's also a cost reduction at the same time, is the identification of where the likelihood of defect is, and then plan to actually address that, and then check it, make sure that it is actually doing what it's doing. So I think that when you're looking at the cost of quality in generally, I think it's the wrong term. I think that this is a fundamental issue that the quality industry has got. The cost of quality is actually, or should be, an investment in cost reduction. You cannot keep wasting raw materials, even if you do have to rework them, or you can rework them. The fact is that you've got the cost of rework, the cost of new materials, and you've also got confidence. Any time that you have a failure, it is a confidence kick, basically, because how assured are you? And remember, what we're talking about here, in all three of us, is quality assurance, not quality control. And the quality assurance has to be based on how sure are you of your processes. There's only one way of doing that, and that's to test them. There's your investment. And then putting things in place to actually, when you do find that there is an issue or an error, is to put in, for example, poke-yoke and things of that nature, where you say, okay, let's remove that likelihood. So again, you can actually, if you have a streamlined process, which is proven to be working in a zero defect environment, you are actually saving money. So how much are you saving? What's the percentage? Well, it depends on what your scrap rate is. It depends on how much time you lose by putting things right. Yeah. And that is, I mean, any operations manager can tell you how much per hour he should be producing. But if he's producing every 10th unit has to be reworked, well, he's lost the 10th unit plus the time of rework, plus unassurity, that's not the right word, but he's unsure of how stable his production line is, which normally means he slows his production line down.
Yeah.
And that again adds cost.
Yeah, for sure. So what you're saying is quality is, quality assurance is cost reduction. It actually comes with more benefits. I mean, just having very good quality assurance is great for customers. In some cases, if a company has a reputation for consistent quality, and not just consistent quality, but everything that comes around it in the widest sense, right? The products are reliable, they don't fail early in the field, and so on and so forth. It's not just quality of manufacturing, it's also quality of design. Then when you achieve that kind of reputation, isn't it much more than cost cutting? So where I'm going is, should we talk about costs first, or should we just say quality? I mean, that should be a major goal at the top level for companies.
Yeah, well, if you look at the reputation, for example, that BMW had for quality, outstanding. I remember many years ago, I was rebuilding a BMW 320, and I stripped the engine and took the crankshaft in, and basically they said it's got a fault. So I said, I'll buy another one. 2 weeks later, I got one in the post with a note from BMW. BMW crankshafts don't break. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's, that's reliability. Or you can go the other way. And I think that, not to, rubbish any supplier, but let's say a well-known Swedish company who had a reputation. Yeah. Who had a reputation, and the joke was that why do they have an electric rear windscreen? And the answer for that was to keep your hands warm when you're pushing it. Yeah,
sure. There's a lot of stories like this. Yes.
There's lots of stories like that, but when you think about it, these are true. You can have the reputation of your product as being good, or you can have a reputation of your product being mediocre. The question is, what market are you playing in? So if your products are, shall we say, have to be good, then they have to be good. If your market or your business model is it doesn't really matter, providing it's cheap,
and
then the cost of quality is not the same.
And that is a serious issue that plagues a lot of importers of consumer goods actually in China, not just China, Vietnam, India, and so on, because the factory just produces without any significant quality assurance, and then who will bear the cost of poor quality? Customers, and the customers.
And you've gone to the point there, Renaud, of that's the external cost. I remember when I was working in the rail industry doing some consultancy work, and the new product introduction manager, I spoke to him and I said, we can get 12 months warranty on whatever the component it was. And he turned around to me very correctly, and it made me think. He said, I don't want warranty, I want it to work. And and that's sort of stuck with me, because I bought a component and I went away, a charger or whatever it was, and it failed on us. Well, I was in a different country, it was no good, and it's like, okay, well, we'll give you the money back, but actually I don't want the money back, I want the product to work. That's why I bought it, because I wanted that product. So but the warranty side is a major cost to the companies, because somebody's paying for the paperwork, the administration, the returns, the post, everything that's involved in that is huge. But that's where it pushes back to what Clive was talking about, back into the production line, is stopping those quality defects. But by paying workers and paying inspectors, unless it's a legal requirement to do certain audits, but to pay for inspectors and checks and put additional checks in, you can keep on doing that and doing it. And as Clive said, slow the production lines down, you can do all that. But if the fundamental thing is, if you are not instilling a culture into the people of continuous improvement, practical problem solving, or whatever titles we want to call it, but actually get into the root cause analysis to solve the problems. And then not only solving the problem, but then standardizing that and looking at where else that same type of defect could occur that hasn't occurred yet, but it could occur. So that's the sideways thinking of, once you've found that problem, standardizing it across that particular component or whatever that is. So that to me is the fundamental, is the culture, the practical problem solving, the root cause analysis, PDCA. We can give it all the fancy titles, but ultimately it's getting to the root cause, finding what the problem, why it happens. Is it lack of maintenance? Is it because the person wasn't trained correctly? Where they work into the standardized work? Is the standardized work in place? All those elements all fit into the whole production culture of the people to ensure that you are not passing on poor quality.
So if I hear you well, what you're saying is, if you really do good root cause analysis and good fixing at the root, it in the long run, it actually doesn't necessarily increase costs. It could actually cut costs because you improve your process. However, a lot of times, and you know that people say, oh, do an AD on this, do something. I want to make sure it never happens again. And then instead of really working on the process, they say, well, we're going to add this administrative measure. We're going to have an inspector check this, and we're going to have someone check that, and then do that for a while, and your cost balloon and balloon.
But what you're saying there, though, Renaud, is that adding inspectors is not solving the problem.
It's a control, right?
Yeah, it's just controlling the problem. It's not actually removing the problem.
Right.
So, for example, if you don't know why, and if you look at the vast majority of problems, the vast majority of failures, they will go either a process failure or a control failure. The process has been wrong, it's not been controlled enough, or the actual controls that you put in place were not detailed enough to find that problem. So, you're not looking at multiples of reasons. Your root cause will take you to actually what caused it. And for example, really good supplier quality management can save you enormous amount of problems. If you, not only in your own company, but if you instill within your supplier base as well, that your acceptable quality limits are X. They are not Y, they are X. And if it falls out of that line, we won't accept it. So I believe in that the quality must go through your entire supply chain. You must have that, the ethos of being, what is acceptable to us is not the same as what is acceptable to Tom, Dick, or Harry, and controlling that. Yeah.
And that comes back, Clive, to something that we discussed in the last podcast, is how do we put that positive tension onto the suppliers? And I think this is it is a big one, because we get a sub assembly coming through the door, and we may have an inspection process within the warehouse or whatever that is before the components are stacked on the shelves or go to the production line. But if we find a failure with a supplier part, ordinarily it's put to one side and somebody picks up another part that's an okay part. And it's what that PDCA, what that feedback is back to the supplier, and what support can you give the supplier to rectify those problems.
Yeah, how can you work with those people? That boils down to, like we said before, though, Max, was that relationship. It's how do you view the relationship with that supplier? If we're talking about cost, there is a classic example of cost which is not quantifiable. Yeah, okay, that part failed, we'll just go and get another one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. The question that I always have with this is, you found that one, what about the other ones that you haven't found?
Exactly.
Where are they, and what are the implications there?
And that's something that I found that Toyota, sorry. That's one thing that I found that Toyota was very good at. Obviously, supplier development, etc., to work alongside the company just in time, all the other elements there. But if we had parts that were coming in from a supplier, say into the weld shop, let's just say that it was a small company making some form of brackets, metal stamping brackets, whatever. If we found a defect on those parts, then for sure we needed to keep the production line running. So we would, put it 100% inspection in, or a rework or whatever with the components. But immediately we would contact the supplier, and they understood that it was their responsibility then to send someone to site to rectify, to sift, to sort, to 100% inspection or whatever that was. So immediately the supplier was totally aware that there was a problem there, and they were bearing the cost as well, because they'd lost a man from their production line, from their factory, in supplying it out to ourselves. So
that was the cost of their quality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What I was getting to there was a lot of companies, or should I say, just about every company that I've worked in since then, would just simply, because their focus is keeping the production line running, they would bear the cost of that, because they would just bend the bracket or re-weld it or whatever the rework was on that particular component. They would do that to keep production running. And what's that cost is, yes, you could quantify it and say it's taking me a man day every day to do it until whenever. But if that relationship with the supplier and the quality is not there, and that feedback loop, then you'll bear that cost for for forever.
Ever and a day. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the point again, Max, you're absolutely right. Though, what I'm suggesting is that when you do, for example, your designs, and you've got to, I mean, we haven't talked yet about design for quality and design for manufacturing, because you know there are costs involved within. You know, I say that any fool can make 10. The trick is making a million, and it's making a million and not 1,000,010. You know, there's no point in actually making product which is no good. There is literally the net result of that is bankruptcy. For me, designing quality means that you can save cost, because you are not going to have this enormous amount of rework, and you're not gonna have product in the field which fails unless you want it to fail at certain points at certain times. Okay, so now we're looking at a different aspect to all of this, which is now the cost of transportation and shipping. You cannot afford to be shipping bad quality now, because the cost of a container will just eat your profit. So again, I come back to the fact is that trying to establish a justification on quality of pricing is wrong. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. You can't say, well, it costs us 10 and we make 12. So it's the wrong way. Actually trying to justify increasing your quality as against the cost of putting it in there, I think is wrong. I think it's the wrong mythology around that. We should be looking at increasing our quality as a cost saver, not as a cost or a cost implication, because that's the wrong way round. Bad quality costs a lot more than good quality. Yeah. Not only is it about the product, it's also about your reputation, how your customers see you. You don't have to send customers bad quality more than a few times for them to start looking elsewhere. That is your true cost. It's an investment, and that's, to me, you invest in your processes, you invest in your people, you train your people. We all know that every quality assurance system out there in the world tells you it's the buy-in from everybody within the company that actually helps to drive quality improvement. The truth is, you have to have buy-in from your customers that understand that you are investing in your production, you're investing in your quality to help them. And if a customer comes and said, well, okay, we want really great quality but a really low price, well, you know, we all want to go out there and buy Ferraris at the same price as a Mini. Doesn't work. If you can work with your clients as well, which again is where half of this is we want acceptable quality at an acceptable price, then you can work with that. But if you know, for me, if the first question is always how much, my next question is thank you and goodbye, because you set it off on the wrong perception of the service that you deliver.
Yeah,
quality is investment. Sorry for going on there, guys. That's something I feel a little bit strongly about.
We can see that. It does make sense. And that brings us to another question I had, and we touched on this, but let's touch on it from the perspective of the average Chinese manufacturer that exports, let's say, consumer goods, okay? Because these people, very often, they have a very limited understanding, right, of quality. You go in their factories and you talk to people and you see that they don't even they don't have a train in quality. There's not even a proper quality manager, and so on. And then you try to talk to top management and they don't understand anything about this. They're like, what, you know, I just see money coming in, money coming out, you know, what is he talking about? So what is the role of the customer with a relatively unsophisticated manufacturer? Maybe Max, do you want to touch on that? I mean, first, what are the basics, right? You need to explain what you need to receive, what you can accept, and things like that, right?
Okay. So from my experience, having worked in China, I think one of the considerations that any company has that is buying parts or components or sub-assemblies or whatever that is from China is that the Chinese people have a different view on quality. Their outlook on quality, their acceptability of quality is perhaps different from ours. Certainly when I worked in the automotive industry in China, the particular company that I worked for, although it was a global company, they only supplied internally to they supplied their sub-assembly to cars that were being manufactured within China for the Chinese market. And the reason for that was because they would accept a lesser quality. So these particular components that I was making were, surface products within the interior of a car. So it was visual to the occupants of the car. But their level of acceptance, it was difficult for me to understand that, having worked in some of the major automotive companies across Europe. It was difficult for me to understand how they would accept a lesser quality level. But that's a cultural thing, and we're not necessarily going to change that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, because the cost against rework in those components, the dies, the stamp, or whatever that is, versus what their acceptable level is. So what I'm saying, the point that I'm getting to there is there's a difference between their internal market and what they are supplying outside of their country. So I think it's very important for any company that is going to buy components or sub-assemblies or whatever from Chinese manufacturers, is the need to be able to go in there and have a look to ensure that they're putting the right controls and measures on what's acceptable, because they can do a quality check, and what's perhaps acceptable to you and I, is not acceptable by you and I, would be acceptable by them. So it's what that standard is as well. So it's the standard of what we accept as say in Europe, for example, is quite different from what they would accept, because this particular organization I was working for were supplying parts into a well-known German brand, but it was only for the internal market. They were being made in China and they were only for the internal market. But those components were not acceptable by the same company that manufactured the same product in Germany. So there's a consideration there for anybody that's either already got suppliers from China or are thinking of setting up some supply chains out of China. I mean, it's not difficult to do, but you do need to understand that there is a difference there. Therefore, you need to put that in place, put something in place to be able to support that.
I agree with Max there. I would add, though, Max, that the actual client bears a great deal of that responsibility as well.
Mm-hmm.
If they, and we've seen this over the past 18 months, especially with PPE market, which was an atrocious mess, that the buyer doesn't actually know what he wants. So he can't tell the supplier here what he wants, because they find it impossible to articulate the exact standards which they would use. And that's where there is a great deal of confusion. I work with some fantastic companies in China. I'm working with one now, and they understand what they need to do. And they're willing to go to that length with me to get to that point. Now, standardization, yes, is a must. But at the same time, simply saying, I want it black is not good enough.
No.
What Pantone colors do you want? What's the finish? What's all of these questions? Now, what I've found in the past is that many buyers either don't know or are afraid to say, because they believe that if they tell them what they really want, the price will go up and they're not doing their job. that's where the buyers actually bear that responsibility. I cannot put in a quality system to manufacture a product to a standard which I don't know what that standard is.
Of course,
it is just impossible. Yeah. Now, should it be that the question is not that the Chinese don't want to make it to that standard, because I believe that there are companies in China that do. I work with them.
Agreed.
It's the people at the other end of the spectrum which are saying, I want it quick, cheap. And I don't care. Because if someone tells me I just want it cheap, I read that to I don't care, as long as it's cheap.
Especially in the average Chinese person's mindset in the manufacturing sector, I want it cheap means I can accept poor quality. It's always related I've heard that 100 times. Yeah, but they don't want to pay a high price. So, but you accepted the standard. Yeah, but they wanted a low price. So it means there's a lot of giggle room around the standard. Oh, okay. That's
yeah, but what you're looking at here, there is only one way of curing this problem, Renaud, and that's for the notification bodies and the standards authorities to actually enforce what they require. I mean, we've seen this. Okay, if you read MDD, for example, there was so much wiggle room there that you could drive a double-decker bus through there.
So just for the listeners, yeah, Clive is talking about medical devices and the directive for general medical devices that has been fortunately removed not long ago.
Yeah, and now with MDR, medical device regulations, it is much more precise. The requirement that you have to fulfill as a manufacturer is as it should be now. The question is, will the buyer accept that this is what the norm is? And there is obviously increased liability, which is good. There's increased liability throughout the supply chain now, whereas there wasn't before. People were hiding behind platforms. Talking with people at the BSI, which I was last week, there is a growing awareness, not just within the medical device industries, but across multiple markets and multiple sectors, that this realization of we have to now start to crack down. And I think that's one good point. But if you look at the customs and people like this, even just a cursory inspection of documentations, there's not enough customs agents. What do you do? That must, in my view, pass on to the actual client. He's buying it. He should know what he wants, and he should be the one which sets the standards. The manufacturers will make it to that standard if they're told, and they're inspected.
Yeah, and I think on that point there, Clive, obviously when there's devices such as you're currently working with on medical devices, where there are very strict guidelines and standards and regulations, etc., there's that element of it, but then there's also the element of supply of let's just say components, items, whatever, that aren't regulated by governing bodies such as that. And I think what you touched on, Clive, is about the standard. So just linking in what I was getting to with the sort of the cultural difference and the standards is certainly, if you're a company who is looking to have a product supplied from China and you're from the West, from Europe or whatever, what we believe is a given, as in, well, of course it's going to be undamaged or unmarked, or of course it is. That's what we would expect. If that's not written into the standard exactly, then the failing is on the buyer, as you said, Clive. Because because having my experience within China is they will make a component and they will supply it, But if it's not setting the standard, then it's like, well, that's not what you set as the standard. So again, it goes back to very clear of exactly what the standards, what the expectations of the buyer, the customer actually is, and working with the supplier to ensure that they understand what your expectations are and what you're paying for. Because yes, okay, it can come down to cost, but it shouldn't do really, because if you're making a part correctly, you're making a part correctly to the standard. That's
exactly. That's it. There is no if, buts, or maybes. Does it meet that standard? Does it meet what you've wrote down as your acceptable quality limits or your levels? What is it? If you cannot say that, you can't blame the supplier.
No,
because the supplier will look at the price and say, well, I can make it at that standard for that price. If you haven't said what that standard is, well, it's how long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
There is nothing to judge it by. However, if you have that supplier that's looking at your relationship as a partnership long term, and we all know in China they don't think long term as what we would do of development and things like this because of the geopolitical situation, but that's not the issue. The issue is regular supplier meetings, telling them exactly what you want, even if it comes to a point of asinineness of making sure that the dots are correctly placed and everything. It pays in the end. That will increase your quality. That will increase getting what you want. Now, if you don't tell them and you haven't wrote it down and you haven't put the right numbers on drawings, for example, or the right material specs, and you haven't actually said, we want, for example, here's one that we say, I do not believe in a certificate of conformity from anybody. I simply do not believe it. I will take that certificate of conformity and I will test that product. Does the product meet the certificate of conformity? And that is a simple yes or no. If it's no, it doesn't, then you have a problem. Then you're going to have to work with that. If it does, you have got a level of assurance within yourself that these guys are doing it right. If you back that up with periodic inspections or predictive failures, I mean, if you start running SPCs and you start looking at what your trend R squared numbers are, and those R squared numbers are within your tolerance bands or your upper and lower control limits, you have got an assurity. You can drop your inspection rates. You can look at how fast you can run the line up there. If you have none of that, which must always start from the identification of what the client needs and how do you get to that point, that is investment. You're investing in the client's investing in the product that he's buying from you, unless he's just buying cheap, where he has got no personal investment in that product. Okay, the question has to be brought back to the client. Is the client investing in his own product? If the answer to that is he just wants it cheap, then the answer is no, he is not. He just wants it cheap so he can ship it out. It breaks down next week. It doesn't matter because we could buy it again and get paid twice. There's your real cost.
Yeah. There's a lot of cases like this, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have something to add on this, Max, before we wrap up? Or?
No. Very good. I'm good.
Great. Well, that's I think Clive brought us all back to to the basics here of making sure you work with the right people who actually care about quality. Otherwise, all of this discussion is not very relevant. But I think we touched on great points here on the role of the customer in actually educating the supply base, on the way to actually drive quality improvement in the long run without necessarily increasing a lot of the costs. Actually, it should drive the costs down if we work on the processes and fix the problems at the root, and maybe an interesting discussion on whether we should talk about quality and costs together and use costs to justify quality improvements. I think both of you made some great points here. So thanks a lot for joining me today. That was quite interesting, quite enlightening, and thanks to the listeners. And you will hear again from the podcast next week as usual. Thank you. Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Max.
Thank you. Thanks, Renaud.
Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to like and share, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other places that you get your podcasts from. See you next time.